It's a warm evening in early autumn, the kind where the air still holds onto summer's warmth, but carries whispers of the coming fall. I remember it clearly because some moments etch themselves into your memory, permanently altering the landscape of your life. This was one of those moments, sitting across from Alex at our favorite coffee shop, the one with mismatched furniture and local artwork hanging on exposed brick walls. We'd been friends for nearly 3 years, meeting in a literature class where we bonded over our shared love of Kerouac and our mutual disdain for our professor's monotone lectures. Our friendship had always been comfortable, marked by long conversations about everything and nothing, but tonight felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when everything goes quiet. Alex had been unusually quiet that evening, stirring his coffee absently, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the steam rising from his cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but deliberate. "You know, I've never been with a guy before." The statement hung between us, neither a confession nor a casual remark, but something in between. A door cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. I'd known Alex as someone who dated women exclusively. He'd had a serious girlfriend throughout most of college, and after they broke up, there had been a few casual relationships, all with women. He'd never expressed interest in men, at least not openly. Yet there was something in the way he said those words, a vulnerability, a question mark at the end of a sentence that grammatically didn't need one. Our society puts immense pressure on people to fit neatly into boxes, straight or gay, masculine or feminine, leaving little room for the vast spectrum of human experience that exists between these artificial poles. Alex had grown up in a conservative small town in the Midwest, where deviation from traditional paths wasn't just discouraged, it was actively condemned. His father was a pastor at the local church, and while Alex had moved away physically from that environment when he came to college, the internal journey away from ingrained beliefs is often much longer and more complex. I remember watching him in that moment, noticing the way his fingers tapped nervously against his mug, how his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. I'd always seen Alex as confident, sometimes bordering on cocky, but in that moment, he seemed younger somehow, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I didn't want to break the fragile thread of trust that was forming between us, so I simply nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Does talking about it count as a first step?" he asked, finally looking up at me. His eyes held a mixture of fear and hope that made my heart ache. It wasn't just a question about semantics or definitions. It was about permission to explore, to question, to step outside the boundaries that had been drawn around his life long before he had any say in the matter. Let me explain why this question matters so much. When someone begins questioning their sexuality or considering experiences outside their established pattern, talking is indeed a crucial first step. It's the verbalization of thoughts that might have existed only in the privacy of one's mind for years. Speaking these thoughts aloud makes them real, tangible, something that exists in the world rather than just inside oneself. It's a profound act of courage, especially for someone like Alex who had been surrounded by messages that such thoughts were wrong or shameful. The coffee shop around us continued its evening rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from a group in the corner, but it felt like we were in our own bubble, a space where time moved differently. I considered my response carefully, knowing that how I reacted could either open a door further or slam it shut. "I think talking is absolutely a first step," I told him. "Maybe even the most important one." I watched as some of the tension left his shoulders, a subtle shift that might have been imperceptible to someone who didn't know him as well as I did. "What brought this up?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, non-judgmental. Alex took a deep breath, wrapping both hands around his mug as if drawing warmth from it. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he admitted. "Years, maybe. But I never let myself really acknowledge it, you know? It was like this thought that would appear, and I'd immediately push it away, pretend it wasn't there." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "But lately, it's been harder to ignore. And I trust you. I thought maybe talking to you would help me figure things out." The trust he placed in me felt weighty and precious. I'd known friends who had struggled with similar questions, who had spent years denying parts of themselves because they feared rejection or judgment. The internal conflict can be exhausting. Constantly monitoring thoughts and feelings, trying to fit them into acceptable parameters, wondering if there's something wrong with you for having them in the first place. Alex had dated women throughout college, including a serious relationship with Emma that lasted nearly 2 years. They had seemed happy together, at least from the outside. After they broke up, he'd mentioned that something felt missing, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was. At the time, I had assumed it was just the natural end of a relationship that had run its course. Now, I wondered if there had been more to it. Have you ever felt attracted to guys before? I asked gently. He nodded slowly. Yeah, but I always told myself it was just, I don't know, appreciation. Like how you can think someone's good-looking without being attracted to them. He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I got pretty good at explaining it away. This is a common experience for many people questioning their sexuality. The rationalization, the mental gymnastics performed to maintain a sense of identity that feels safe and accepted. We're taught from an early age to categorize and label, to see sexuality as fixed rather than fluid. The idea that attraction might exist on a spectrum, that it might shift and evolve throughout our lives, isn't something many of us are exposed to growing up. I think that's normal, I told him. A lot of people go through that process of questioning and trying to understand their feelings. There's no rush to figure it all out, or to put a label on anything. Alex nodded, seeming to absorb my words. It's just, I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I had it all figured out, And now I feel like I'm starting from scratch. There was a raw honesty in his voice that was new, a dropping of the confident persona he usually maintained. The conversation continued as the coffee shop began to empty around us. We talked about his past relationships, about moments when he'd felt confused or disconnected. He told me about a guy in his freshman dorm who he'd felt drawn to in a way he couldn't explain at the time, about how he'd deliberately distanced himself, afraid of what those feelings might mean, about how he sometimes felt like he was playing a role in his relationships with women, going through the motions of what was expected rather than what he truly desired. As he spoke, I could see the relief washing over him, the unburdening that comes from finally giving voice to thoughts long kept silent. This is the power of conversation, of breaking silence. Each word spoken was like removing a small weight, allowing him to stand a little straighter, breathe a little easier. I'm scared, he admitted after a while. What if I'm wrong? What if I explore this and realize it's not what I want? Or worse, what if it is what I want, but I can't handle what that means for my life, my family? These fears are at the heart of so many struggles with identity. The fear of making a mistake, of misreading one's own feelings. And perhaps even more powerful, the fear of being right, of confirming something about oneself that might disrupt relationships, disappoint loved ones, or require a fundamental reshaping of one's life story. Those are valid concerns, I acknowledged. But here's the thing about exploration, it's not a one-way street. You're allowed to try things, to see how they feel, and then decide what's right for you. And whatever you discover, it doesn't invalidate who you've been up to this point. It just adds another layer to who you are. The concept of emotional intimacy versus physical intimacy became a central part of our conversation. Alex wondered aloud if his hesitation to be physically intimate with men was a sign that his attraction wasn't real enough. This is a common misconception, that validity of attraction is measured by physical desire alone. But intimacy exists in many forms. The emotional connection, the desire to be close to someone, to share thoughts and feelings, can be just as powerful an indicator of attraction as physical desire. Talking about this stuff, being vulnerable with you, it feels intimate in its own way, Alex said. Like I'm sharing a part of myself I've never shown anyone before. And he was right. Vulnerability creates a special kind of closeness. In some ways, sharing our deepest thoughts and fears is more intimate than any physical act could be. It requires a level of trust, a willingness to be seen completely, that is profound and meaningful. As our conversation continued, we explored the concept of identity beyond labels. The idea that perhaps the question wasn't whether Alex was straight, or gay, or bisexual, but rather what kinds of connections felt authentic and fulfilling to him. What if, instead of trying to fit himself into existing categories, he allowed himself to experience attraction and connection without immediately needing to define it? This approach, focusing on experiences and feelings rather than labels, can be liberating. It removes the pressure to arrive at a definitive answer and instead encourages exploration and self-discovery as an ongoing process. It acknowledges that sexuality can be fluid, that it can evolve and change throughout our lives. The coffee shop was preparing to close by the time our conversation began to wind down. The barista was wiping down counters. Chairs were being stacked on tables, subtle signals that our time in this space was coming to an end. But the conversation we'd had wouldn't end when we walked out the door. It would continue to resonate, to spark further reflection and exploration. As we gathered our things to leave, Alex paused, looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening, for not making this weird. That's what friends are for," I told him, and meant it. But I also recognized that our friendship had shifted slightly that night, had deepened in a way that would be impossible to reverse. By trusting me with his questions and uncertainties, Alex had invited me into a more authentic version of himself. It was a privilege I didn't take lightly. The weeks following our coffee shop conversation brought subtle changes to our friendship. There was a new openness between us, a dropping of pretenses. Alex began to share more of his thoughts about attraction and identity, sometimes texting me random observations or questions that occurred to him throughout the day. It wasn't that our entire friendship became centered around his exploration of sexuality. We still talked about books and movies, complained about work, debated the merits of various pizza toppings. But there was now space for these conversations too. Alex also began to seek out other resources, books about sexual identity, online forums where people shared similar experiences, even a support group at the community center for people questioning their sexuality. Each step seemed to bring him more clarity, more comfort with the uncertainty of the journey he was on. "It's weird," he told me about a month after our initial conversation. We were at my apartment, sprawled on the couch watching a documentary neither of us was particularly invested in. "I don't feel like I have more answers now. If anything, I have more questions. But I'm somehow more comfortable with not knowing." This is often how growth works, not in straight lines toward clear destinations, but in spirals that sometimes bring us back to familiar questions with new perspectives. The goal isn't always to arrive at definitive answers, but to become more comfortable with the complexity of human experience, to expand our capacity for understanding ourselves and others. About 2 months after our coffee shop conversation, Alex went on his first date with a man, a graduate student named David whom he'd met at a bookstore. He called me immediately afterward, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "It was normal," he said, sounding almost disappointed. It just felt like a regular date. We talked about books and our families and whether pineapple belongs on pizza. It wasn't this big, dramatic thing. I laughed at his tone. "Isn't that good, though? That it felt natural?" There was a pause, and then he laughed too. "Yeah, I guess it is. I think I expected some kind of moment of truth, you know? Like suddenly everything would become clear. But it was just nice. I liked him. I want to see him again. That's all." And perhaps that's the most important realization, that exploring different aspects of attraction and identity doesn't have to be earth-shattering. It can be as simple as following what feels right, what brings connection and joy, without needing to make it more complicated than it is. Over the following year, I watched Alex grow more comfortable with the fluidity of his identity. He dated both men and women, sometimes seriously, sometimes casually. He had conversations with his family that were difficult, but ultimately strengthened their relationships. He found community among others with similar experiences. And through it all, he maintained a sense of curiosity and openness that was inspiring to witness. Looking back on that evening in the coffee shop, I'm struck by the courage it took for Alex to ask that question. Does talking count as a first step? It was a small moment in many ways, a quiet conversation in a corner of a busy place. But it was also the beginning of a journey that would reshape his understanding of himself and his place in the world. And isn't that how most important journeys begin? Not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with simple questions asked in moments of vulnerability. With the courage to speak aloud the thoughts we've kept silent. With the trust that in sharing our truths, we might find not only understanding, but also the freedom to become more fully ourselves. In the end, talking wasn't just a first step for Alex. It was the step that made all other steps possible. It was the opening of a door that had been locked for too long, allowing fresh air and light into rooms that had been kept dark. And in witnessing his journey, I was reminded of the power of conversation, of vulnerability, of the simple yet profound act of asking questions without knowing where they might lead. So if you find yourself wondering, questioning, curious about aspects of your identity or experience that you haven't allowed yourself to explore, remember this: talking counts. It more than counts, it matters. It's the beginning of a conversation with yourself and others that might just lead you to a more authentic, more fulfilling way of being in the world. And that journey, however it unfolds, is worth taking. Total _chart_count, 13,587.